James sent his cousin a text on a Tuesday afternoon in October. It was short. It said, "Hey, I'm good. Just need some time." That was 4 years ago. Since then, there have been no calls, no replies to anyone, no birthdays acknowledged, no holiday messages, no just checking in texts sent or received. He changed his phone number once, moved apartments twice, once across town, once to a completely different city. He deleted every social media account he'd ever had, including ones people didn't even know about. He made himself, deliberately and carefully, very hard to find. His mother still leaves voicemails on the old number, not knowing it belongs to someone else now. His best friend of 12 years, someone who had been in his life since they were teenagers, eventually stopped trying after about 18 months of silence. His cousin, the one who got that last text, told anyone who asked that James had some kind of breakdown. It was easier than the alternative explanation, which required looking inward. From the outside, the story of James looks like one thing. It looks like a man who snapped or cracked or gave up. People who knew him said things like, "Something must have happened to him," or "I always knew he was a little off," or the one that probably stings most if you ever say it to someone who's been through this. He was so selfish for doing that to his family. None of those explanations are true, or at least none of them are the whole truth. James didn't disappear because he stopped loving the people in his life. He didn't do it because he was cruel, or because he was having a breakdown, or because something dramatic happened that nobody knows about. He did it because he had reached a point where staying, continuing to exist inside the version of his life that he had, felt like it was slowly, quietly destroying him. And today, we're going to try to understand that, not to excuse it, not to wrap it in some kind of inspirational message about protecting your peace, but to actually look at what brings a person to that point, what's happening inside them when they make that choice, what it costs the people around them. Chapter 1. Who James was before the silence. To understand why James went quiet, you have to understand who James was before that. He was not a cold person. He was not someone who struggled with relationships or kept people at arm's length. Growing up, James was actually the kind of person every group has, the one who keeps things together, the one who remembered the details. If you mentioned in passing that you had a job interview coming up, James would text you that morning to say good luck. If you were going through something and needed someone to talk to at an inconvenient hour, James picked up. He showed up to things he didn't have to show up to. He gave, consistently and without a lot of fanfare, more than most people around him ever gave back. His family would have described him as reliable. His friends would have said he was one of the good ones. And they weren't wrong. He was all of those things. But here's what was also true about James, and this is important. He had learned very early in his life that his own needs were secondary, not because anyone sat him down and told him that. It happened the way most things happen in families, gradually, quietly, through patterns that were never named. His mother was a woman who loved him genuinely, but who was also, for most of James's childhood, carrying a lot of her own unprocessed pain. She didn't have the emotional bandwidth to hold space for a child who had needs of his own. So James learned not to bring those needs to the surface. He learned that the way to keep the peace, the way to make things okay at home, was to be easy, to not ask for much, to manage his own feelings privately, and present a version of himself that was low maintenance and warm and reliable. That worked, as a child. It's actually a very intelligent adaptation for a child to make. You figure out what the environment needs from you, and you give it, because that's how you stay safe and loved and connected. The problem is that those adaptations don't disappear when you grow up. They follow you. They shape how you move through every relationship you ever have. And for James, that meant he entered adulthood already primed to give more than he received, already skilled at absorbing things quietly rather than naming them, already uncertain, at a deep level, whether his needs were worth taking up space for. He didn't know any of that about himself yet. He just knew he was a good friend and a good son, and that he was tired in a way he couldn't quite explain. Chapter 2. The long, slow build-up nobody saw. Here's something that surprises people when they hear it. Most people who eventually cut everyone off don't do it suddenly. There is almost always a long period before the silence, sometimes years, where nothing looks unusual from the outside. During that period, the person is still showing up, still answering texts, still attending the family dinners and the birthday gatherings and the group chats full of memes and life updates, still laughing at the right moments, still being, to all outward appearances, present. But something is happening underneath that. For James, it started as a kind of low-level awareness that grew slowly into something heavier. He started noticing patterns he had been too close to see before. He noticed that when he was going through something hard, a stressful period at work, a health scare, a difficult stretch where he was genuinely struggling, the people in his life didn't really ask. Or they asked once, got a surface-level answer, and moved on. Whereas, when they were going through something, James was the one who followed up, who checked back in, who sat with them in it. He noticed that gatherings in his family almost always ended with him feeling smaller than when he arrived. Not because of any single dramatic thing anyone said, but because of the accumulation of small things. The jokes that came at his expense that everyone laughed at, including him, because it was easier to laugh. The way his opinions got talked over. The way his accomplishments were met with a kind of polite acknowledgement before the conversation moved to someone else. He noticed that with several of his friendships, the dynamic had quietly settled into something lopsided. He was the one who initiated. He was the one who remembered. He was the one who drove to the other person's side of town, and he tried to address it. That's the part people don't always believe, but it's true. He tried. He had one honest conversation with his mother about feeling unseen in the family. She cried. She apologized. She told him she didn't realize. For about 2 weeks after that, things were different, and then, very gradually, they went back to exactly what they had been. He told his closest friend that he felt the friendship had become one-sided. His friend took it well in the moment, said he understood, said he'd do better, and then went quiet for almost a month, and when they reconnected, it was as if the conversation had never happened. After you have enough of those experiences, where you try genuinely to name something and nothing changes, you stop trying. Not out of stubbornness, out of exhaustion, because each one of those attempts costs something, and when nothing comes back, you run out of what it takes to keep making them. That's where James was when his cousin called. Chapter 3. The phone call that broke the dam. People always want to know, what was the thing that happened? What was the big event? Because from the outside, when someone just vanishes from their entire life, there has to be a story, a betrayal, a blow-up. Something dramatic enough to justify that level of response. For James, there was no dramatic event. What happened was ordinary. His cousin called on a Tuesday, not to catch up, not to see how James was doing, not for any reason that had anything to do with James at all, but to ask for money. This was not the first time. The cousin had a pattern of calling when he needed something, and being largely absent the rest of the time. James knew this, but he'd always answered anyway, always found some version of yes, or at least a gentle no, that kept the peace. This time, he said no clearly, and his cousin got angry, said some things that were unkind, not catastrophic, not the worst thing anyone had ever said to James, but unkind, and then he hung up. The call lasted 8 minutes, and James sat with his phone in his hand after it ended, and something that had been building for a very long time just settled, like a decision that had already been made finally becoming visible to him. He didn't rage, he didn't cry. He sat quietly for a while, and then he sent that text, "Hey, I'm good, just need some time." And then he started, methodically and calmly, making himself unreachable. This is something worth really sitting with, because it goes against the way we usually tell these stories. We want a villain, we want a scene, we want a reason big enough to match the action. But the reality is that for a lot of people who reach this point, the triggering event is often something small, something that by itself would be forgivable, even understandable. A cousin asking for money is not a tragedy. But it didn't land in isolation. It landed on top of everything else. On top of years of feeling like his presence in people's lives was primarily useful rather than valued. On top of years of quiet adjustments and swallowed feelings and conversations that went nowhere. On top of a reservoir of exhaustion that had no more room left. Researchers sometimes describe this as a last straw phenomenon, but even that framing undersells it. It's less like one straw breaking a camel's back, and more like a person who has been holding a wall up with their hands for years, and their legs finally give out. The wall didn't get heavier. The person just ran out of what it took to hold it, and when James's legs gave out, his solution was not to figure out how to hold the wall differently. It was to walk away from the wall entirely. Chapter 4. What's actually happening inside them. In the weeks after James went silent, he did not feel free. He did not feel relieved. He felt guilty in a way that was almost physical. A persistent heaviness in his chest when he thought about his mother. A sick feeling when his best friend's name popped into his head. He'd reach for his phone out of habit and then stop himself. He'd have full conversations in his head with people he was no longer speaking to, explaining himself, trying to make them understand. But underneath the guilt, something else was also happening. He was sleeping through the night for the first time in he didn't know how long. He was eating regular meals. He was waking up in the morning and not immediately running a mental checklist of who needed what from him today. He had whole days where he felt not happy, not free, but quiet. And that quietness felt like relief in a way he hadn't expected and couldn't fully explain. This pattern is documented in people who make this choice. There's often a period of guilt and grief, genuine grief, because even relationships that have been draining you are still relationships, still people you love, still histories and memories and shared language, followed by a kind of psychological decompression that catches people off guard, because the relationships they withdrew from, even when they were full of real love and real history, had also become a source of constant low-level stress that they'd been so immersed in they didn't recognize it as stress anymore. There's a concept in psychology called the fawn response. Most people know fight or flight, the two survival responses we all learned about. Some people know freeze. But fawn is less talked about, and it's worth understanding. The fawn response describes a pattern where a person manages threat or tension by appeasing others, by becoming agreeable, by caretaking, by making themselves smaller, by anticipating what other people need and providing it before conflict can emerge. People who grew up in environments where their own needs were routinely deprioritized, whether that was because of a parent's emotional unavailability, or a chaotic household, or simply a family culture that didn't have language for emotional needs, often develop the fawn response as a default. It becomes automatic. You walk into a room and you're already reading the emotional temperature, already adjusting, already figuring out what's needed from you. James had been doing this his entire life without ever having a name for it. Every relationship he had was organized at some level around this dynamic. James makes room. James keeps the peace. James adjusts. And when he finally stepped out of all of those relationships at once, the fawn response had nothing to respond to. For the first time in his adult life, he was only responsible for himself, and his nervous system slowly started to settle. That's not a permanent solution. It doesn't address the underlying pattern, but it does explain why people who make this choice often report that even in the grief of it, there is something that feels like coming up for air. Chapter 5. The people left behind. Now let's talk about the other side of this story, because James's disappearance didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened to people. His mother spent the better part of 6 months convinced that she had done something specific, something she couldn't identify. She went back through her memory of their recent conversations over and over, looking for the moment she said the wrong thing or made the wrong choice that broke something irreparably. She couldn't find it, which was in some ways worse than finding it, because at least with a reason, there is something to understand. His best friend moved through stages that looked almost like the stages of grief. First confusion, because there was no explanation, no context, no goodbye. Then anger, the kind that surfaces when someone you love does something that feels like a rejection of everything you built together. Then sadness. Then a kind of resigned acceptance that took about 2 years to arrive, and even then didn't quite settle. His cousin told people James had a breakdown. This version of events traveled through the family and became the official story. It was comfortable because it put the explanation inside James. Something wrong with James, something that happened to James, rather than anywhere that might require anyone else to look at themselves. When someone cuts you off without explanation, it creates a very particular kind of pain. There's a term in grief research for loss that society doesn't build rituals around. It's called disenfranchised grief. When someone dies, there are funerals and condolences and a recognized process for mourning. But when someone who is alive and well simply chooses not to be in your life anymore, there's no container for that grief. Nobody sends flowers. Nobody asks how you're holding up. The loss is real, but it has no formal shape, and that absence of shape makes it harder to carry. James's mother was grieving. His best friend was grieving. And they were doing it alone, mostly, without acknowledgement, because what do you say to people? My son decided he doesn't want to know me anymore. There's no script for that. There's no community support. There's just the wondering and the silence and the unanswered phone calls. Chapter 6. Is it always the right decision? About 3 years after the silence began, James started seeing a therapist. He had been resistant to it for a long time, not because he thought therapy was pointless, but because part of him was afraid of what he might find out about himself in there. What he found was uncomfortable in ways he hadn't expected. His therapist confirmed things he already knew. The patterns were real. The exhaustion was real. The dynamic he had lived inside for most of his life, where his role was to give and manage and absorb, was real, and it had done real damage. None of that was in his head, but she also started asking questions that he didn't have easy answers to. She asked him to think about whether, before he left, there were people in his life who might have responded differently if he had been more direct. Not in the gentle, careful way he usually raised things, but truly direct, in a way that made clear how serious it was. She asked him to think about whether there was a version of some of those relationships where a boundary, clearly stated, might have changed something, and James sat with those questions. He didn't like them, but he sat with them. Eventually, he admitted something. The way he had been raising issues, gently, carefully, leaving himself an escape route, framing everything so that nobody felt accused of anything, had not actually communicated the severity of what he was experiencing. He had been hoping people would read between the lines. And people, even people who love you, are often not very good at reading between the lines. They take what you give them at face value. He also admitted that direct confrontation, the kind that was clear and uncomfortable and left no room for misinterpretation, was something he had spent his whole life avoiding. Not because he didn't have things to say, because saying them felt dangerous. It felt like the kind of thing that ended relationships, and he would rather carry the weight quietly than risk the relationship. The painful irony, of course, is that carrying it quietly ended the relationships anyway, just in a different direction. This doesn't mean James was wrong to leave. His therapist wasn't telling him he should have stayed and kept suffering. She was helping him understand which parts of his decision came from a genuine assessment of the situation, that these relationships had run their course, that the patterns were too entrenched to change, and which parts came from a much older wound, a wound that said, if I tell people what I really need, I will lose them, so better to lose them on my terms. That distinction matters enormously, because cutting people off is sometimes exactly the right thing to do. For someone leaving a family system that has been abusive or controlling or that requires them to deny who they are, that distance is not avoidance. It is survival. It is self-preservation. And no one owes their presence to people who harm them. But sometimes the same action, disappearing from everyone, is also a coping mechanism that has outlasted its usefulness. A strategy that served someone well at 8 years old, but is running the show at 32, long past the point where it's actually necessary. And if that pattern goes unexamined, it doesn't just affect one set of relationships. It follows the person into the next chapter of their life, into the new friendships, into the next time something gets difficult and the old instinct kicks in, disappear. Only the person living it can tell which situation they're in. And usually they can only tell with time and with honesty, and often with help. Chapter 7. What happens to them long term? 5 years after that Tuesday text, James has what he would describe as a small life. Not small in a sad way, small in a deliberate way. 2 close friends, both people he met after the silence. People who know him only as the person he became after all of that. A job he finds genuinely satisfying. A city that's his own, not layered over with the geography of everyone else's expectations. A routine that belongs to him. He doesn't talk about his family often. When he does, it's in a tone that is hard to read. Not bitter, not wistful, not angry. Something more like the way you might describe a country you lived in for a long time. Familiar, known in your bones, but not home anymore. He doesn't know if he'll reconnect with anyone from his old life. Some days he thinks yes, maybe eventually, maybe his best friend, maybe after enough time has passed that they can look at each other differently. Some days the question doesn't come up at all, which is its own kind of answer. What does the research say about where people like James usually end up? Long-term social isolation, even chosen isolation, even isolation that brought initial relief, carries real risks. Loneliness, the kind that persists over years, has documented effects on physical health. It's linked to elevated cortisol, disrupted sleep, weakened immune response. The human nervous system evolved for connection. It doesn't stop needing it just because someone decided connection was too costly at a particular point in their life. At the same time, and this is important, the research on loneliness consistently shows that what matters most is not the number of relationships a person has, but the quality. A person with 2 relationships that are genuinely reciprocal and honest, where they can be fully themselves, where they're not managing or performing or absorbing, is in measurably better shape than someone surrounded by 20 people who leave them feeling more alone than silence would. James, by that measure, is doing better than his old life would have suggested he could. But he's also still in the process of figuring out what it means to let people in, really in, when you've spent a lifetime learning that letting people in is how you get depleted. That's the work. And it doesn't have an endpoint. It just has a direction. What we take from all of this, I want to close by speaking directly to whoever is watching this. If you are someone who has done what James did, if you've gone quiet on people, cut off a family, disappeared from a life, I'm not here to tell you it was wrong. You know your situation better than anyone watching a video could, but I would ask you to spend some time being honest with yourself about one question. Is this protection, or is this the wound deciding for you? Those two things can look identical from the inside. The difference usually only becomes clear when you're willing to sit with it. If you're someone who has been left, who is living in the silence of someone else's disappearance, who is carrying grief that has no name and no clear place to put it, I want you to know that the silence is not always about you. Not entirely. Sometimes the people who leave are carrying something so old and so heavy that the leaving is less about what you did and more about what they needed to survive. That doesn't make it painless. You're allowed to be hurt by it. But they stopped caring about me is rarely the whole explanation. And if you're watching this because you want to understand someone, because someone in your life went quiet and you don't know why, and you're looking for a way to make sense of it, the most honest thing I can offer is this. People rarely cut everyone off because they stopped caring. They do it because caring, in the specific way they had been doing it for a specific set of people, became something they could no longer afford to keep doing. That's not a comfortable answer, but it's truer than they snapped, or they were selfish, or something must have happened. James is still out there, still quiet mostly, still working out what version of connection is possible for him now, on his own terms, with what he knows about himself that he didn't know before. And that's not a tragedy. It's just a life in progress, like most of ours.